There is a growing collection of videos on this channel that are a result of me getting curious about something and then falling down a rabbit hole. For those not in the know, I work at a museum where my job is essentially to look after over 12,000 artifacts. As a result, I get to work with some really interesting objects, but I don't necessarily have time every day to explore the uses of every single object that I come across. I'm a very curious person by nature, and I'll admit I'm very easily distracted, so that is part of the reason why I started this channel in the first place. I can do some research in my free time, I can sate the little curiosity demon that lives on my shoulder, and I can make a video about it and share it with other people who care about these random little things that I learn along the way. This is exactly how my Victorian calling card video came to be. I was rehousing a bunch of these cards and I began thinking, like, how are these used? What exactly are they? And lo and behold, a whole video was made about it. But anyway, I've been working on this project where I've been cataloging and digitizing photographs from the 19th century, although there are a couple photos that are from the 1920s and 1930s as well. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll see that I occasionally post to my stories some of my workday, and lately, if you've been following me, you'll see that there's a lot of photographs probably showing up on your feed. The 19th century photographs really began to catch my eye, however, as I didn't really know much about the history of photography in the first place, and I needed to learn a little bit about it so that I could properly catalog them. And I kind of fell down a rabbit hole and learned about the carte de visites. A carte de visite was a small photograph mounted on a piece of cardboard about the size of a calling card. The backs of the cardboard would usually have the name and address of the studio where the portrait or picture was taken. Occasionally, they might have a handwritten note on the back, but for the most part, it's just the portrait studio and any other advertising on the back. Also, as a side note, if you want to start collecting antiques and you're not really sure where to start, these things are everywhere, and for the most part, as far as I know in my personal experience, that you can find them for pretty cheap. The ones that I've got kind of in the background here, I bought for like $3 or $5 a piece for the more expensive ones. So if you'd like to start collecting antiques, I'd definitely suggest looking at some old photographs, just because it's also just fun to kind of stare at faces from the past. But on that note, I essentially became so enraptured by these photographs and what they came to mean in Victorian society, and I fell down the rabbit hole and I ended up buying a few for myself, essentially. When I first started, I thought that these photographs were just that, simply photographs. But as I came to learn more about them, I began to realize what a phenomenon these carte de visite were in the 19th century. So the history of photography itself is partially to blame for why the carte de visite became so popular in the 19th century, but I'm not going to cover the whole history of photography in this video. If that's something that interests you, I can provide some links in the description down below, but just consider this to be a quick and dirty summary of everything that's kind of relevant to what we're talking about today. People started playing around with the idea of photography in the 1820s through a process that was called heliography. A French inventor by the name of Joseph Nicephore Niepce is credited as being the first person to capture an actual image through this process. The first images created through the heliography method were fairly crude and not particularly clear, and on top of all that, they required hours of exposure time for the image to actually be captured. Over the next 20 years, various photographic methods came and went, including the salt press and the Talbot type. Each new process became more detailed, and the act of taking a picture slowly became easier. The art and science of photography would make a massive leap in 1839 when a man by the name of Louis Daguerre introduced the world to his daguerreotype. This new method of photography required way less exposure time, and as a result, after 1839, you began to see portrait studios open in major cities all around the world. Other photographic methods came and went, but the one that is most relevant to the carte de visite is the albumen silver print. So these images actually use the white of an egg to create crisp and clear images. The man who is most commonly attributed with the creation of the carte de visite is a man by the name of André Disdéry. Both Daguerre and Disdéry were credited as being the first in their respective photographic methods. However, there were other people doing the same thing earlier in time. These two men just happened to slap a patent on their respective methods before anybody else. The albumin print process, combined with the multiple lens camera, combined with Disdairy's patented method of taking multiple pictures on one single negative plate, ultimately opened the way for mass production of photographs. Before, when you got your portrait taken, you would get one single photograph out of it, and depending on the process, you might not be able to make copies. However, with these new processes, you could get multiple copies of the same photograph, and if, say, the 8 that you bought when you first got your portrait taken got destroyed, you could go back to the studio and ask the photographer to print you off more, as they likely had the original glass plate still in their collection. With the door to mass production of photographs now wide open in the 1860s, Cartomania ensued. In Rachel Tucholsky's article, Cartomania, Sensation, Celebrity, and the Democratized Portrait, Cartomania is defined as the craze for collecting carts of people one didn't know, famous or notorious public figures who constellated the world of gossip and conversation. As it became cheaper and easier to take pictures, photographers began to play with just what exactly they could capture with their camera. It wasn't uncommon for a photographer to use his photography as an excuse to go traveling, take a bunch of pictures, and then come back and sell copies of the pictures of all of these wonderful things that he saw on his trip to the general public. Buying and collecting photographs, having your picture taken, became a really big thing in the late 1860s. Not to mention just having your portrait taken became a very common occurrence, and not just for the wealthy. The photography process, due to its mass production, had now become so affordable that people from the middle and lower middle classes could now go and have their picture taken. Whereas before, photographs took much longer and required more expensive materials and a photograph specialist, now there were studios and photographers filling the streets of every major city who would be willing to take multiple photographs for a fairly affordable price. A magazine called Photographic News, which followed the development of the science and art of photography, wrote in 1861, "Photographic portraiture has swept away many of the illiberal distinctions of rank and wealth, so that the poor man can command as perfect a lifelike portrait of his wife or child as Sir Thomas Lawrence painted for the most distinguished sovereigns of Europe." This democratization is part of the reason why you can find dozens of these in pawn and antique shops today. The shop that I got these photographs from had dozens of them, and they were only selling them between like $3 and $5 a piece. So once you had started your collection of cartes de visite, you would compile them into an album or 2 or 3, and you would have them set out on a table in your parlor or your drawing room, and it would inspire conversation amongst a host and their guests. These albums would contain everything from portraits of friends and family to bought portraits of famous people or statues or landscapes. Queen Victoria is said to have had over 110 albums just filled with photographs that she had collected over the years. The albums and the photographs within them became staples of the world of gossip and conversation, allowing parties to have an icebreaker if necessary. But it also became practice to hand out your own portrait to friends and family so that they would have a portrait of you for their own album. I really wanted to learn more about this practice of handing out your own picture. I didn't know, it kind of reminded me of like the calling card in the sense that you're handing out something that either has your name or your image on it, but there doesn't seem to be any set rule of etiquette. I mean, there might be something out there and I just didn't find it, which is completely plausible. I know that sometimes these cartes de visite and other photographs would be mailed, often with like handwritten notes on the back, but I couldn't find any of the intricate social rituals that kind of pervaded throughout the rest of Victorian culture surrounding handing out your own portrait. It kind of reminded me of the Victorian calling card, and I would think that considering it's not just your name, it's an image of yourself, you should think that there would be a lot more intricacy into it, but I couldn't find anything. Not to say that it's not out there, I just personally couldn't find anything on it. While the carte de visite had its heyday in the 1860s, it too would eventually fall to a more fashionable and desirable form of photography, in their case, the cabinet card. The cabinet cards were collected in the same way as the carte de visite, However, these were much larger in size so that they could be placed on one's curiosity cabinet and seen from across the room with ease. The cabinet card also featured far more elaborate images, as by the time they came to the spotlight, over a decade of the Cartomania craze had passed. As a result, cabinet cards began to take over. Props and elaborate backdrops became staples of photography studios everywhere, and the carte de visite slowly faded out of popularity. In a way, the carte de visite very much remind me of the early 2000s craze of Pokemon cards. While I don't think anybody was trading a shiny Abe Lincoln for a first edition Queen Victoria, I do find the carte de visite still quite interesting. It makes me feel very lucky to be able to carry a camera around in my pocket and take 8,000 pictures of my cat, and I can only imagine how nerve-wracking it must have been to go and have your potentially once-in-a-lifetime portrait taken. In the late 19th century, people of most social classes could send a near-perfect likeness of themselves to friends and family to either put in an album or sit on a cabinet, and I think that the novelty has honestly persisted till today. We still get excited and ask people to take pictures of us with friends and family or in front of this big statue or monument, and we're still collecting them and putting them in photo albums or on social media. To conclude, photography has continued to democratize itself. From a late 19th century photography studio to your best friend's Instagram page. If you enjoyed this video, thanks for sticking around until the end. If you're interested in these types of videos where I repeatedly fall down rabbit holes that I get curious about, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Instagram, leave a like if you feel like it, do all of those things. You know what to do. And I'll see you next time.